So, welcome. Today we're going to talk about supplements and specifically fiber. We've got a supplements webinar coming up, and we'll be covering several items. In fact, let me go back and just do a quick summary of the kind of items we'll be covering. Prediabetes supplements, including vitamin D, K2, berberine, gymnema, magnesium, cinnamon, fiber, bergamot, curcumin, chromium. So we'll talk a little bit about each of those categories. We also have a section on niacin. We'll have a section on statin-related supplements, and for the most part, that's CoQ10 and ubiquinol. A lot of people think that there's significant differences between CoQ10 and ubiquinol. There are differences. The question is, are they significant? So a lot of interesting questions around supplements. Another thing to think about, and it's in our title for today, and that is it worth it? Now, here's the question. Most supplements are relatively inexpensive, and most supplements are also relatively harmless, relatively side effect free. But that's not always the case. People have died from supplements, such as specifically vitamin D3. Vitamin D3 is in many ways a hormone more than a supplement, and it has a major impact on calcium management. It impacts the kidney, and in fact, people have died from too high a doses of vitamin D3. So, Carl, you may be able to show a little bit of information about how to sign up for the supplements webinar. If not, hopefully you can tell us a little bit later as we get going into the topic on fiber. With fiber, there's a lot of information out there. Part of the question is figuring out what's misinformation and what's information. There was a question before we even started about hearing that too much psyllium fiber specifically decreased testosterone. I haven't heard that one. That question got a little bit deeper too. So we'll go and maybe deal with that a little bit more later. I'd love to see more details on that because it got into the Germans using testosterone or something for COVID-19. Again, I wasn't very much aware of that either. We're going to just cover some of the information and, again, misinformation about fiber and talk specifically about psyllium. I, by the way, do use psyllium, so I think that might help you know my position on it. I do think there's some questions about exactly how much good it does do, but I don't think there are that many questions about how much harm you can get from psyllium, and clearly not how much it costs. This is a raggedy looking bag. Here's why. I use psyllium in a smoothie that I make every day. It's a really ugly, it used to taste bad, but I've gotten used to it. It's an unattractive smoothie, but you know, it's sort of like the taste that you hate once a day. It's got natto in it, not nattokinase, natto, a source of vitamin K2. It's got several other things in it, and I've got a video on that. I'm not going to get too deep into that, but what we will do is get into psyllium and fiber. Today will be a shorter video. We're going to have some shorter YouTube Live videos over the next few weeks. Carl, do you want to give us the water ball so we'll get started on the program? So on the right, you'll see a couple of the articles that we looked at in terms of developing some of the summary for the science around psyllium fiber. One of them is a clinical trial, long-term cholesterol-lowering effects of psyllium as an adjunct to diet therapy in the treatment of hypercholesterolemia. The other one is dietary fiber is beneficial for the prevention of cardiovascular disease, an umbrella review of meta-analysis. Now, there's actually a technical term about umbrella review and meta-analyses. I'm not going to go there. I'm just going to say, basically, it's a relatively good meta-analysis. I'm going to leave that at that point on that title. The other thing I'll say is this. As you see in both of these titles, well, at least specifically in the first title, but you get some of that in the second title as well, in the meta-analyses. These studies, and a lot of the studies with psyllium and fiber are based on an assumption that was very prevalent 5, 10, 20 years ago, but there's a lot of debate on right now. What assumption is that? That assumption is that the higher your cholesterol, the greater your heart attack and stroke risk. So as you know, that whole argument is now a debate, and it gets into some further detail like, wait a minute, which cholesterol? Total cholesterol, remnant cholesterol, LDL? I think at the end of the day, I think very few of us are going to argue that remnant cholesterol is a problem. Most of us would argue that HDL is a good thing to have. A lot of people would say it's neither good nor bad. It doesn't help. It's just a marker. We're not going to talk about that debate today either. But the real big debate in terms of cholesterol is LDL really a risk factor? Just to let you know, in full disclosure from my perspective, what's my position in that area? I don't think it matters nearly as much as 99% of doctors out there. I don't completely agree, though, with some folks like, I think it's Nir Ali. He's a cardiologist that you'll find on YouTube, where he says, no, higher LDL is better. I think that's a fairly weak case, but I do think this, simple, easy logic. Half the people having a heart attack have an LDL that's a little bit higher than the standard recommendation. So it's outside of normal, and that doesn't make sense. The other half, here's why it doesn't make sense, because the other half have cholesterol levels, LDL levels, that would be considered, quote, totally normal, totally no risk, yet they're having a heart attack. So there's something going on. And the fact that it's almost half and half also indicates that the levels of LDL that we focus on tend to not be as big a driver as most of us think. So let me just add one other distinction in this area, though. There's a thing called FH, familial hypercholesterolemia. And given what I do, you might imagine I've got a lot of patients with that. Now, these people have one of the key determinants or one of the key diagnostic risk factors is having an LDL 180 or above, not total cholesterol, LDL 180 above or above, with or without statins. So those folks, they're, again, just a brief genetics in that space. They're about 2,000 SNPs. SNP meaning single nucleotide polymorphism. A lot of people think of that as a mutation. It's not really a mutation. We're not going to get into all that either. But it is a genetic variation. There's about 2,000 genetic variations that lead to familial hypercholesterolemia. And I can tell you, when these people have LDL levels of 200, 300, 350, 400, there does appear to be some added risk. But even then, the sum is the key point here. Most of these people, even though they have these high levels of LDL, tend to not have their heart attacks until they start getting other risk factors like smoking, like most often insulin resistance. So just to help you understand, I don't necessarily buy some of the assumptions that go into the majority of the research around psyllium. Now, one final comment, and then we'll start getting into the details. It's not just cholesterol. They look at other things as well, like death rates. So we'll start getting a little bit deeper into this as we get into the details. So getting enough fiber on a low-carb diet, yeah, according to some people, is hard. I don't think so. In fact, what I would suggest is that, excuse me, I have plenty of people, you know, this whole debate about plant-based versus animal-based. And I have a lot of people that see me. A lot of my patients are plant-based, vegan, you name it. And they also say, well, it's impossible to go low carb on a plant-based diet. No, it's not. In fact, I've gone through episodes just to demonstrate it. And I've got a lot of patients who do it all the time who are completely vegan, but also still low carb and even keto. So a lot of people that are plant-based and low carb, even people who are the ultimate plant-based as in vegan and the ultimate low carb as in keto. So you can do that. I know I'm maybe conflating two different issues. They're saying getting enough fiber. The bottom line is you can get enough fiber on a low carb diet. Study number 1, eligible subjects, men and women with serum LDL cholesterol concentrations between 3.36 and 4.91. These are obviously the rest of the world, not the US numbers, millimoles per liter. They were randomly assigned to receive either 5 grams of psyllium or a cellulose placebo 2 times daily for 26 weeks while continuing diet therapy. In the results, you saw a serum total and LDL cholesterol concentrations 4.7% lower and 6.7% lower in the psyllium group than in the placebo group after that 24 to 26 week period. The probability of that happening is just a pure random chance is about, or it's less than 1 in 1,000. That's what P is less than 0.001. That's what that means. Other outcome measures did not differ significantly between groups. So that is one of the key study types that you'll see when you hear people say psyllium or fiber has been proven to decrease heart attack and stroke risk. From my perspective, that's not a huge change in total and LDL cholesterol. It's clearly not enough change to translate into a major impact on life expectancy. So again, that's what you tend to see. I don't put a lot of weight on all of those studies that are in that category. Here's study number 2, a PubMed search from January 1, 1980 to January 31, 2017. Was conducted using the following search strategy: fiber or glucan or psyllium or fructans, and meta-analysis or systemic review. So only the English language PubMeds were used. It provided quantitative statistical analysis on cardiovascular disease, lipid concentration, and blood concentrations. So here's where you're beginning to, you're seeing I'm talking about This is where they're getting into studies which show a little bit more of a end result as opposed to just looking at LDL and trying to assume that that's going to drive end results. So the result on study number 2, all 31 meta-analyses comparing highest versus lowest dietary fiber intake reported statistically significant reductions in the relative risk of cardiovascular disease mortality. Relative risk was 0.77 to 0.83. In other words, people that had higher levels of fiber in their diet were had about 4/5 or 80% of the cardiovascular disease mortality rate as people that did not have fiber. That's the information that I look at and say, I've heard both sides of this argument. To me, it's still a little bit soft, but not that soft. That to me is enough to say, you know what? The taste I hate once a day. Here's some other things that they looked at as well. Coronary heart disease, again, 0.76 to 0.93, 80 to 85% relative risk or disease rates there, and stroke as well. So again, that makes you think that it is having an impact on vascular health. The fact that you're seeing it with cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, and stroke. Meta-analyses are on supplementation studies using beta-glucan or psyllium fibers also reported statistically significant reductions in both total serum and low-density lipoprotein cholesterol concentrations. Again, that last sentence where they're looking at cholesterol again, I understand why they are. If I were doing that study, I would look at that as well if that information were available. But I'd end up the same way I end up now, knowing what, or at least given the position that I have, that LDL is maybe not a major driver, probably not a major driver. Not sure what to do with that information. So as we know, LDL is important, but not nearly as important as carbs and cardiovascular inflammation. The greater issue here is reduced glucose absorption and decreased insulin secretion. That's one of the things you begin to wonder. Is that what's going on? Is fiber actually decreasing our absorption, or in some other way impacting glucose metabolism? Significant fiber in the diet is seen as decreasing the glycemic index of food, which may again be the issue, decreasing absorption, therefore decreasing the insulin response, therefore decreasing the concentration, of both glucose and insulin in the bloodstream, both of which are very inflammogenic or inflammation causing. It decreases the swings in glucose. With cardiovascular inflammation as the #1 cause of heart attack and stroke, swings in blood sugar are by far the #1 cause of cardiovascular inflammation. Things begin to make a little bit more sense. There's also the gut biome issue, which may also speak to insulin resistance. And if you don't know what that's talking about, there have been studies where you see that in terms of fecal transplants, both in lab animals and in humans, where if the donor of a fecal transplant had diabetes or significant prediabetes, the receiver of a fecal transplant did not, that fecal transplant will often result in prediabetes. So in other words, there's something in our gut biome that tends to drive insulin resistance as well. So that is that's the brief program for today. And Carl, if you'll give us the transition, we'll go ahead and start with Q&A. So Carlson Nielsen, this is that first comment that I mentioned earlier in the video, that too much fiber is said to be able to lower testosterone. I haven't heard that, haven't seen it, which is what the Germans used for treatment of COVID-19. I had not heard that either. So, Karsten, you just got a lot of information on me today. For COVID-19 to be able to fight COVID, and will fiber help? Eat less equals no diabetes, heart disease, etc. So I think this eating less fiber, will that cause lower cardiovascular disease? I think you just saw my position, or at least what I've seen in the science so far. And the science is not, it's not all over the waterfront. It's not inconsistent, internally inconsistent. The meta-analyses tend to show the same thing over and over with decreased cardiovascular disease. ZV1, don't know who that is. Usually I'm Z06, I think is Joe Riley. Is potato starch a prebiotic? I know there's a lot of people that have that position. I do not know one way or another. I don't have a position on that. I think it's a good question. I would love to hear opinions of other folks that are watching. Carl Jones, my total cholesterol, UK scale, is 3.1 without a statin. I am type 2. Thank you for sharing that, Carl. Let me see. Okay, Karsten Nielsen again. Does fiber suck up dietary fat from the intestine, stop hunger, or work as activity to burn energy for processing through intestines? I don't think we know exactly what mechanisms are involved in fiber in terms of decreasing the glycemic index. I think one of the things that we do know is that it slows down the absorption of glucose. Is it because it's impacting dietary fat? Is it making dietary fat stick around in the intestine longer and making that more difficult, therefore slowing everything else down? I don't think we know. Again, I'd love to hear what others have to say. Fiber, Carl Jones, fiber slows and stops nutrient absorption. I think we do. I think most of us would agree. It does slow down absorption. Obviously, that's the major component by decreasing the glycemic index. The question that I think Karsten was asking was, what specifically, are there specific subcategories? Does it focus on fats and then bring carbs along with it, or what? Bob Bell, MyFitnessPal lists the fiber content. It generally runs about 20 to 25% of my carb intake. I subtract the fiber to enter net carb into my diet analysis. That's another thing I'd love to see some reactions on. I tend to, some people are major fans of net carbs. Others are, net carbs is a fallacy, it's a wish. I tend to do like I do with a lot of science, a lot of facts. I do agree there is some reason to say it's not totally ironclad. However, I don't think you can throw out the whole concept of net carbs. I do think there is value to it. And here's one of the reasons I think there's value to the net carbs concept. What did we just find in this meta-analysis? When you add fiber to a known diet, you're decreasing the glycemic index. We know that. The meta-analysis, the study number 2 that we looked at, also showed that, there's a decrease in cardiovascular disease as well. So I do think that there is validity to the net carb concept. I also agree with some of the critics that I don't think you can just totally subtract all the carbs the way that you do in that typical net carb equation. Carl Jones, don't take this the wrong way. The facial hair looks good. Just saying. Take what the wrong way? Thank you very, oh, don't take it. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Robert Simpson, is fiber a good remedy for diarrhea or loose stools? A lot of people would say it actually makes it worse. Others would say, no, it does make it better. There's another medication called cholestyramine, which is very much related to a fiber. It's more of a sequestrant in terms of its mechanism, meaning it tends to pull cholesterol and some things out of the food, the diet, the contents of the gut, so you don't absorb them. That tends to decrease diarrhea. In fact, it's a standard treatment for diarrhea or loose stools. James Cantor, Dr. Brewer, how do you feel about ground flaxseed versus psyllium as a good source of fiber? Well, I'm not a super expert in the area of ground flaxseed, but here's what I understand. I do have a big bag of flaxseed, both ground flaxseed and actual whole flax seeds. Now, I know you get plenty of fiber with both of those components. I really don't use them that often, and here's why. They have a lot of, both of the things that I have anyway, have a lot of calories. And yes, they're fiber-based, they have more calories than I tend to use. They also have a lot of oils. Now, I do use flaxseed oils sometimes, but not very much. I stick with avocado oil mostly because of its stability with cooking, and the good old standby olive oil when you're not cooking. So I hope that helps. Not sure that it did. Somebody gave us a super chat. I don't know who that was. We'll find out in just a minute, but thank you very much for doing that. Farouk Farr. Farouk is in Iran, I think, and one of the areas that just got nailed early on in the COVID pandemic. And Farouk, I mean, people were saying, oh, well, kids don't get this problem. Young people don't get COVID. They don't die from it. And Farouk said, look, guys, they do. I'm watching it every day. And then again, a couple of weeks later, Farouk actually had a young, healthy family member die with it. So thank you so much, Farouk, for what you've shared with this audience. I think all of us have learned a lot from your contributions. Hello, Dr. Brewer. Do you still take K2? No question. In fact, I take more than most supplements recommend on K2. As you know, I've covered, gosh, I've got about half a dozen videos now on K2. So much so that one of my more informed viewers wrote an email and said, Doc, give up on K2. We get the point. Thank you very much. And I'm sure that's the way I feel too. But then you get one of the most common questions that we get, especially when you're talking about supplements, is K2. So there are about 700 videos, 800 videos out there now, just in our channel alone. Over, a half dozen of them have to do with K2. Most people haven't seen them all. I'm sure a lot of people tell me they have, but I know I'm the only person that has actually seen them all because I did them. Bottom line, I don't think K2, the standard thing that you'll hear about K2 is that it tells the body where to put calcium. And so therefore it takes calcium out of, here's where they're going with it. So therefore it'll take calcium out of the coronary arteries and put it back in bones where it needs to be. I don't think that's what K2 does. I know that K2 is very much associated with carboxylation of certain enzymes, and I'm not going to get into much more detail on that other than to say that Yes, it impacts activation or carboxylation of certain enzymes that have to do with putting calcium in bone, taking calcium out of bone. Same thing with other tissues. Here's what I think, though, and nobody knows yet exactly what goes on and how it impacts. And we're really, the science is not extremely clear regarding just how much of an impact K2 has. But I did find this study, and I've been meaning to do a video on this study for the longest time. It's in my list, but you know what? There's several hundred topics in my list that I still haven't covered yet, and I'm planning to do. It was a clinical trial, and it was on relatively young, relatively healthy men who had prediabetes. The study group got vitamin K2. The other group got a placebo, and it actually improved. The guys that got K2, it actually improved their insulin resistance. So I do think there's yet a mechanism involving insulin resistance that we just don't understand. Now, how did people start thinking about that in the first place? Was it because they were thinking about cardiovascular disease? Probably not. What happened is those enzymes that impact calcium in the bones are actually also very much related to insulin resistance. So I think that's where their original connection came from. Now, one other point about that study. Is it conclusive? No, it wasn't big enough, and it hasn't been repeated enough yet to be conclusive. Do I suspect that there's the issue? Again, that's where I'm suspecting the issue is. Final point about that is instead of most of the supplements that use 100 micrograms of K2 per day, they used 4. So what do? I have a supplement where I get 200 micrograms per day. In addition to that, I take natto in that awful tasting smoothie that I mentioned at the beginning of this this video. And natto is one of the major reasons that it's so awful tasting. But I hold my breath, and I used to have to hold my breath. I don't hold my breath anymore. I just swallow it, and then I'm good. Thank you, Farouk. Good question. And yes, I do. I take about 400 micrograms per day of K2. ZV1, it is Joe Riley. Joe, you keep changing and you got to tell us at some point why you go from one Z to another Z to another Z. And yes, Joe was the fellow that gave us the super chat button. Thank you so much, Joe. I greatly appreciate it. And Joe's saying 98%, 92 beats per minute. That's a pretty high pulse rate, Joe. Are you jogging while you watch us, or working out on the treadmill or something? 98% is a good O2 saturation. Joe's doing that, and several others do that on a regular basis, just to remind us of several things. Number one, that you can help us get this information out there by contributing. Number two, and I appreciate all those guys when you do that. And you've been a faithful contributor, Joe. I do appreciate it. The other thing that he's doing is reminding people to know what your O2 saturation is. That's not been a big issue, at least outside of the hospital. It's been a big issue inside the hospital for decades. It's also been a big issue for people with lung disease for decades. But here's why it became a little bit a significantly bigger issue: the age of COVID. COVID is unusual in that coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, it tends to decrease our oxygenation ability. So when you look at the way we breathe, the centers in our brain that tell us inhale, exhale, they are driven more by the pH, the carboxyhemoglobin in our blood, the CO2 level. than they are by oxygen. And so what we have seen, this has been very unusual, unique to this disease, is that people start having problems breathing and they don't know it. They'll, again, they'll be in it right before getting intubated in the ER, and they're sitting working on their phone and really not noticing it. So there's a home device. Many of us have gotten them. Many of us check that home device on a regular basis. It's called a O2 saturation, oxygen saturation device. This one was about 40 or 50 bucks out of Amazon. Up until COVID, you could get them for about 20 bucks. So that's what happens. That's one of those things that the price increased dramatically, as I said. And mine is 97 and 76. O2 sat of 97. Now, what does that mean? What should your number be? And should I go, if I'm usually at 97 and I get what might be SARS-CoV-2, if I get down even to 90, I would call my doc. Clearly below 90. If you're routinely 95, 96, 98, which most of us are going to be, you get COVID-2 infection, you start getting even below 90, I'd call my doc. Below 80, I'd just go on into the ER. So it's just an item to be aware of. Thank you, Joe, for reminders on both of those activities. Cathetopia. I feel good on super low carbs. I try to keep it under 10 carbs a day. That's impressive cathetopia, and that is going to keep you ketotic for the most part. I don't know if you manage or measure your ketones, but 10 grams of carbs a day is going to pretty much keep you ketotic almost all the time. Kinpa-2 are xenoestrogens, phytoestrogens in foods such as flax a concern. I think you meant such as flax a concern, or is that internet nonsense? The major place that I've seen that is in soybeans. And I don't know, Ken. I personally have never worried about eating soybeans. As you may know, I worked for Toyota for a decade. As a part of that, I ended up being getting a lot of exposure to Japanese diet. I actually got more exposure to the Japanese diet when I was in New York. We had sushi and soybeans. I'm blanking on the name. Somebody help me with a fact check. That's a Japanese dish where you get cold soybeans, and that's one of my favorite dishes, and love to just sit and pick those out and eat those while we're talking at dinner. Now, I do know for sure that some of the phytoestrogens, specifically soybeans, can be a problem if with certain conditions, like certain types of cancers. Is it a specific issue for those of the rest of us who don't have those conditions? I'm a little bit skeptical that it is. 147 degrees west. For those of you who don't recognize that, and you don't keep a homunculus of the longitudinal degrees in your head, 147 is in Alaska. And no, I would not have known that had 147 degrees west not told me that. Good morning, Doc. I use net carbs at the menu level. There's not much difference between 20 grams net carbs and 60 grams total carbs. Very good. Thank you so much. Again, always good at giving us some very, very helpful information. Furious Doe, I use far infrared now to get my inflammation down. And I feel it helps. It's because I cannot go and run or bicycle at the moment. Uh-oh, back and leg nerve problem. Thank you for sharing that. I'm not familiar with far infrared. Oh, you're talking about far infrared. Oh, that's interesting. I will tell you this. There's a, is the far infrared the stuff that's used in the dry saunas? If you would let us know and confirm or deny, I would appreciate it. But the numbers on those, on the dry saunas do appear to be pretty good. Joe, 97%, 74 beats per minute, silent pneumonia. Oh, that's not good. Let's hope we get over that. Thank you for sharing, Joe. Kinpatu, edamame. Thank you so much. You know, they say that word finding problems is one of the first signs of senility. So guess what? Given the work we've done with cognitive decline and the work I do in this space, I stay, although I joke about it, I stay hyper about that. But not too hyper, and here's why. I've had word finding problems. I first noticed them when I was in the 4th grade. Yes, 10 years old. Some of us, that's just the way our brain thinks. And one of the other things you'll find about word finding issues is that a lot of people have a lot more word finding issues, or appear to have them, whereas some people are just good at redirecting their conversation around so they don't get stuck on a word that they're trying to remember. So thank you. Either way, thank you so much, Ken Patu, for edamame. That's one of my favorite dishes. No, not kimchi. Kimchi's slightly different. Yes, but also, but I use a mattress. Oh, I think, Furious Doe, you're talking about the far infrared. Okay. So thank you very much for sharing that. And thank you guys for your interest today. As I said, we wanted to go a little bit shorter. And if you'd like to learn more and talk more about the broader subject of supplements, come join our webinar. As I said, we've got a lot of different components we're looking at, very information packed. And we'll also, as part of participation in that, we allow you to use our procurement mechanisms that we now have for supplements. Thank you again for your interest today.